Let's move on to aldosterone and how it affects your fluid balance. So aldosterone is always released in response to low blood pressure. So you have a sudden drop in blood pressure, and that will activate the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway right here, and that leads to increased salt reabsorption, and with the salt goes the water, and that's how you are reabsorbing maximum amounts of fluid and trying to compensate for a loss in blood pressure. So here's how aldosterone works. Aldosterone is a mineral corticoid that is released from the renal cortex in response to a sudden drop in blood pressure, or in general, drop in blood pressure. So aldosterone is released, and it will bind to aldosterone receptors actually in the nucleus of the cells. Keep in mind, aldosterone is a steroid hormone. Steroid indicates steroid. Steroid hormones are lipid soluble. They will cross the phospholipid bilayer without binding to a receptor. They go into the nucleus and they alter transcription. In this case, so the transcription and translation that of the messenger RNA leads to a salt reabsorption mechanism. So you have the hormone receptor complex initiates transcription on the nucleus, and the translation protein synthesis makes new protein channels and pumps, and these pumps will pump sodium. So here the sodium is reabsorbed, and then with the sodium goes the water by osmosis. Here's a flow chart showing you the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. I have to tell you that I'm not that big of a fan of this particular flow chart. I like this one much better, and this is the one that you're going to see on your next midterm and also on the final exam. So it would be a great idea to know this one here. You also saw this when we talked about blood pressure regulation in the cardiovascular part of this course. So here's your renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. It is initiated by a loss in blood pressure, so decreased blood pressure, which is measured as decreased blood flow to the kidneys. The juxtaglomerular apparatus in the kidneys will respond. It will measure this drop in blood pressure and drop in blood flow to the kidneys, and will respond with sending out the hormone renin. Renin will convert angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 will be converted to angiotensin 2 by angiotensin converting enzyme, which is abbreviated ACE here, angiotensin converting enzyme. Once angiotensin 2 is available, then the adrenal cortex will release aldosterone in response. And also, angiotense means that angio is vessel, and tense is to tighten up, so you will get vasoconstriction of arterioles, which all is designed to increase blood pressure. So of course, if you decrease the blood vessel diameter, you will increase blood pressure because you increase the resistance. The aldosterone will lead to insertion of salt reabsorption channels, and with the salt goes the water, so you get salt and water retention by the kidneys, which all are also designed to increase blood volume. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is amazingly powerful, and it will save your life if you have a sudden drop in blood pressure, or you go into shock, you have lost a lot of blood in an accident. So the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is very powerful, and it can save your life. The third hormone that's involved in volume regulation is the atrial natriuretic peptide. And so here it says just natriuretic peptide. It comes from the atria of the heart in response to overstretching of the heart. It's a direct antagonist to aldosterone, but I have to tell you that in comparison to the power of aldosterone, this is a midget. This is an absolute dwarf. The atrial natriuretic peptide is not very powerful. If it was, none of us would be having high blood pressure, and there are many people that have high blood pressure, but it works directly antagonistic to the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, because it will promote the excretion of more salt, and with more salt goes more water, so it's basically a natural diuretic. Now moving on here to the potassium balance. Your kidneys definitely help with the regulation of the potassium balance. You're supposed to have a minimal amount of potassium in the extracellular fluid compartment. Most of the potassium is supposed to be in the intracellular fluid compartment. Aldosterone plays a critical role in the regulation of this. And you should know that if you have too little potassium in the blood, that would be hypokalemia, that leads to muscle weakness, failure of respiratory muscles and the heart. Hyperkalemia is just as bad, can lead to cardioarrhythmias. Too much potassium can easily kill you. That is how animals are being put down, by injecting potassium into their via IV, and that leads to the collapse of the nervous system, basically, because you're destroying the concentration gradients that you need for an actual potential. Causes for a potassium imbalance in your body include kidney disease, diarrhea, and too many diuretics, basically. Now, behavioral mechanisms that keep your water balance in balance would be that you're drinking to replace fluid loss, so you have this feeling of being thirsty when you need to replace fluids. Low sodium diet stimulates salt appetite. We're all pretty much addicted to salt. You notice that when you open a bag of chips, it's kind of hard to say no to the next chip, and so before you know it, the whole bag is gone. But we all have the salt appetite, actually. Now, avoidance behaviors, they can help prevent dehydration. So if you don't go out when it's full sun, it's really hot, and you are getting dehydrated because you're sweating so much, this avoidance behavior, this helps dehydration. You can see this in desert animals. They avoid heat, the mid-heat day, for example. This chart here shows you some disturbances in volume and osmolarity and how you might respond to it. So here's the volume increase, no change, decrease, and then over here the osmolarity, no change, increase or decrease, and how we respond to it. Of course, you want to be right here in the blue range with normal volume and osmolarity. Here's a summary chart of how your body would respond to decreased blood pressure and osmolarity. So here, if you have decreased blood pressure or volume, you definitely want to increase your renin secretion and then set in motion the Renin-Angiotension-Aldosterone System. Also, in response to decreased blood pressure or volume, you're going to send out some vasopressin or ADH, and that will return maximum amount of fluids to your body. If the opposite is true and you have an increase in blood pressure, the body doesn't really worry too much about that. You do have the atrial natriuretic peptide that you could secrete to counteract sort of too much volume by excreting extra sodium, and with the sodium goes the water. But as I said before, your body's not too worried about an increase in blood pressure. It's not something that kills you now, so therefore we don't have to worry about it now. Any increased osmolarity that you have due to increased maybe salt ingestion, that will stimulate thirst, and it will also release ADH or vasopressin if you like that better. Here's your all-inclusive summary chart of what happens when you're dehydrated or have decreased blood volume, decreased pressure, increased osmolarity. So the most important part here, and I admit this is a very crowded slide, so if you will have a drop in blood pressure, the big trigger here, drop in blood pressure, it will set in motion the Renin-Angiotensin-Aldosterone System right here. And we've had this before, so I think you are good with this. If you have an increase in osmolarity in the blood, then you're operating mostly through ADH, so you will increase in vasopressin / ADH secretion, and you will reabsorb water that way. Moving on here to acid-base balance, the normal pH of your blood plasma is 7.38 to 7.42, and that is a very narrow range, and you need to maintain that very narrow range because the way oxygen binds to hemoglobin is vastly affected by your blood pH, and so you need to make sure that you are in this homeostatic range of 7.38 to 7.42. So the hydrogen ion concentration It's closely regulated, and any changes, your body will respond. Abnormal pH affects the nervous system, it affects proteins, it affects how your hemoglobin binds oxygen. It has a lot of effects. An acidosis is an abnormally high concentration of hydrogen ions, and so the neurons will become less excitable. You end up with that central nervous system depression. In alkalosis, you're going to have hyperexcitability. So any kind of pH disturbances are monitored very closely by your body. They also typically are associated with potassium disturbances. So you want to maintain your blood plasma pH in this homeostatic range of 7.38 to 7.42. With your diet, you might end up adding some extra fatty acids, amino acids. These are organic acids, weak organic acids, but still acids. Also, your CO2, as we saw previously, plays a major role in contributing to acids. Also, lactic acid that you might produce from anaerobic metabolism, and ketoacidosis if you are metabolizing mostly fatty acids. Do have available buffer systems. The most important one is the bicarbonate carbonic acid buffer system. Here's a list of your acid and base input. Mostly what we take in with our diet falls more into the acid range. So we have organic acids, lemon juice, for example, other organic acids that we have in our diet. Also some intermediates producing some acids. You may also have metabolic organic acid production, namely would be keto acids. That is especially critical when you're diabetic, because your muscle cells, they can no longer take in the glucose, and so they will be forced into metabolizing fatty acids, and the byproduct of fatty acid metabolism is a lot of keto acids. So under extreme circumstances, it can lead to ketoacidosis. If you have overproduction of CO2, and that can also lead to acid production, because CO2 plus water combines to make carbonic acid, which we saw previously. As far as bases are concerned, there are very few dietary metabolic sources of bases. So how do we balance our blood pH, or how do we get to pH homeostasis? Well, we have powerful buffer systems. A buffer is a substance that resists any changes in pH. So buffers typically combine with or release hydrogen ions without affecting sort of the blood pH in this case. Also cellular proteins, phosphate ions, hemoglobin, and bicarbonate, they can all absorb extra hydrogen ions and resist a change in pH. Ventilation. If you are hyperventilating, then you're getting rid of more CO2, and CO2 essentially acts as an acid. So if you change your breathing pattern, it's a very rapid response, and this is your best chance to counteract anything that wants to change your blood pH. Your ventilation, your breathing pattern corrects 75% of disturbances. It can also cause them. If you voluntarily hyperventilate, you can definitely cause a disturbance, but that would be something that you have to decide, and it's under your control. The kidneys, they are not as powerful as your lungs for sure in regulating your pH homeostasis, but you do have some receptor-mediated endocytosis. You can excrete or reabsorb extra hydrogen ions as needed, and you can indirectly change the rate at which bicarbonate buffer is reabsorbed or excreted. Here's a diagram that shows you the respiratory compensation for metabolic acidosis. So you have an increased concentration of plasma hydrogen ions. That means your pH is going down into the acidic range. And the way you compensate for that is you are exhaling more CO2. That means you will increase the rate and depth of breathing, and that decreases your plasma CO2 concentrations, and therefore it will bring your pH back into homeostasis. Keep in mind that your breathing is your most powerful mechanism of how you can bring your body back into pH homeostasis. 75% of your pH balance can be corrected, or you can stay in homeostasis with your breathing pattern, either increase or decrease your breathing, and meaning getting rid of CO2 or keeping the CO2 in, as depending on what you need. Now your kidneys can do something too, and we'll take a look at that next, the renal compensation for acidosis.